Brought to you by runtogold.com, the premier source for monetary science applied to geopolitical, international, and economic, financial news and events. Welcome back to the 29th episode of the runtogold.com podcast. This will be an interview that I had on Contrary Investors Cafe, where I discuss money versus currency and a little bit of the derivatives problem, and also talk about the new book, The Great Credit Contraction.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Jim, Willie, and Friends. We're here with our friend Trace Meyer today. How are you, Trace?
I'm doing great.
Well, that's good. I'm glad one of us is. To let our listeners know, I'm going to be the quiet one today. We're going to let Trace do all the talking because this one's been suffering from bronchitis for a week. How fun is that?
Not very fun at all.
No. So what you got for us today, Trace?
Well, I just released a new book. I think we talked about it last month. It's called The Great Credit Contraction. And in this book, I talk about, it's essentially an autopsy on the worldwide financial and monetary systems. I march through what money is. You know, a lot of people, we throw out these terms like money and currency, but nobody really defines them. If I were to ask someone on the street, well, what is money? I mean, I'd get all types of different answers from people. And so I actually go in and it's just right off the bat, right in chapter 1, I start talking about the differences between money substitutes, and illusions. And all three of these can be currency. And so to be helpful, well, what is currency? Currency is that medium of exchange that we use in ordinary daily transactions. And, of course, it can be either of these three. And so what do we use in our ordinary daily transactions? Well, for the last 800 years, we've actually moved from using money substitutes, to using illusions. And this has all happened fairly gradually over hundreds of years. But each time we move away from money, we move up this liquidity pyramid. We move into a less safe and a more risky allocation of capital. And so we move from money. So what is money? Well, money has got to be a tangible asset. And the reason it has to be a tangible asset is so that when it's used in a transaction, that transaction is extinguished as opposed to being settled. See, when we have a transaction and it's settled, then the two parties they go their separate ways. For example, I give Michelle a pizza, and Michelle gives me a $20 Federal Reserve note. Well, the transaction is settled when the currency changes hands. However, when I get that Federal Reserve note, well, that's an illusion, and it's subject to risk that's associated with its purchasing power. And so I actually have to find some greater fool than me to take that $20 note in exchange for purchasing power before it's extinguished. On the other hand, when money is used, because it's a tangible asset, then when that transaction takes place, it's settled and extinguished at the same time. For example, I give the pizza, and Michelle gives me the pizza, and I give a 1-ounce silver coin. Well, the silver coin has value in itself, and so the transaction's extinguished. Well, money functioned as currency for thousands of years, and surprisingly, humanity didn't come to an end because we used money as currency. Well, over time, people started issuing money substitutes. It would be a claim on money. It would be a payable on demand. There's a certain amount of gold deposited at the Treasury, payable on demand. We'd have these money substitutes. Well, these money substitutes, they circulated as currency for a long time. They started back in the 17th century at the Bank of England, and eventually Isaac Newton developed the gold standard, which pegged these money substitutes to a certain amount of metal, bullion, because the gold and silver won their way to become currency because they're the most fungible and have the lowest cost associated with using them as currency. So they were the currency, but there's money to be made. There's profit to be made by using money substitutes as currency. So that then the money substitutes began to grow in power, and they were declared legal tender by lots of governments, like the Bank of England or France. And so the capital is moving up this liquidity pyramid. It's getting less safe and less liquid, because sometimes these money substitutes, they would become worthless because the government that was backing them would become worthless, or it would change, and so all of a sudden their little irredeemable tickets, usually paper tickets, would become worthless. And that usually happens through a currency event known as hyperinflation. Well, anyways, so for hundreds of years we were moving with these money substitutes. And eventually Weimar Germany hyperinflated, and it led to the rise of Hitler, and eventually there was World War II. And out of World War II came Bretton Woods, and came the International Monetary Fund. And the brilliant idea that came out of that was, well, we'll make all the other money substitutes convertible into a single money substitute, which would be the dollar. So the French franc and the German mark and all these different money substitutes, they were convertible into the dollar. And then the dollar was convertible into gold. So all of these money substitutes were redeemable actually for another money substitute. So we have a continuing of this credit expansion. We have a continuing of this capital moving into less safe, less risky assets. And eventually, like always happens, because governments are just looting and killing machines, and one of the best ways they can loot a lot of money from people is through what's used as the currency. Well, like every other government in all of history, the United States government decides to declare bankruptcy on their promise to pay money in exchange for their money substitutes that it issued. And so in 1968 and also 1971, the government no longer honored the promise, no longer honored the contract that they had made to pay silver payable on demand or to pay gold to people who demanded it. And so that was an international bankruptcy in 1971 by the U.S. government. The French wanted gold for their dollars. The U.S. said, oh, sorry, we're going to keep the gold, and you can keep our little worthless, irredeemable bits of paper. And so that launched the world into this whole new era where the world reserve currency was no longer either money or a money substitute, but was merely just an illusion. It was an instrument that had no value in itself. And that really is the root cause of all the problems that we currently have in our monetary system, because out of this worthlessness of this asset, well, we've had to develop all different types of assets to hedge against that risk of purchasing power when transactions are settled versus extinguished. And so we've developed all these types of instruments. We've developed credit default swaps, which are a form of OTC derivative. We've developed interest rate swaps, which are a form of OTC derivative. And so during this great credit expansion, we've now created a liquidity pyramid that's got about, in my estimation, $1,600 trillion worth of different assets in it. Most of these comprised of OTC derivatives. And Warren Buffett, as we know, he's not a fan of these OTC derivatives, and he's actually just lost a few $1 billion on them. But he called them, in one of his letter to shareholders, he called them financial weapons of mass destruction. And so what we have now is we've got a bunch of financial terrorists who are costumed in government regalia, like Timothy Geithner or Hank Paulson, and they're detonating these financial weapons of mass destruction within the largest corporations in the world. They've vaporized Bear Stearns. They've vaporized long-term capital management, Enron. You know, those firms from the past. Well, those were all vaporized by OTC derivatives. We've also seen Lehman Brothers, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Citigroup, Bank of America. They're on the ropes. All of these are heavy dealers in these derivatives. And then we have the linchpin of all of them, which is AIG. And so AIG, because they're the reinsurance group, they're the ones that guarantee other people's OTC derivatives. So they guarantee Lehman Brothers derivatives, or they'll guarantee other derivatives that are written by other institutions. Well, anyways, this all raises the specter of something called counterparty risk, because an illusion and a money substitute are subject to counterparty risk. In other words, they're subject to the financial capacity of the counterparty to the contract to perform. So the United States government back in 1971, they failed as a counterparty. They had promised to deliver gold. They failed to deliver, probably because they didn't have the financial capacity to, because they had just printed a bunch of their money substitutes out of thin air, because remember, they're looting and killing machines, and so they printed a bunch out of thin air to loot in order to kill in Vietnam. And so they were a failed counterparty. Well, now we've got other failed counterparties. We've got Lehman Brothers, which is a giant failed counterparty, trillion-dollar balance sheet. Bear Stearns, Bank of America, Citigroup, both trillion-dollar balance sheets that are on the ropes. And these failing counterparties, what happens is these derivative contracts are usually accounted for based on their nominal, based on what's called the nominal amount and not the notional amount. And so to illustrate this, I'll use an analogy. Let's say that we've got a house, and on the house we've got fire insurance. And so the house is worth, we'll say, $100,000, which might be generous in the current market. But these are just numbers. So we've got a $100,000 house, and we've got a $100,000 fire insurance contract on the house, written by, we'll say, Lehman Brothers before they went bankrupt. And the probability, because we've got some brilliant mathematicians from MIT, and they figured out that the probability of the house burning down is only 1%. So Lehman Brothers carries the liability of the house of the fire insurance on their balance sheet as a liability for only $1,000, and the person who owns the house carries it as an asset of $1,000, and then they make their payment for that insurance. Well, because these derivatives are actually pretty hard to value, and because we have a lot of incentive to maximize assets if we own them and minimize liabilities if we owe them, what Lehman Brothers has decided to do is they're really smart mathematicians. They've decided to figure out that this liability is actually only worth $500. So they carry it as a liability of $500. And the person who owns the insurance contract, who owns the right if the house burns down to be paid the full $100,000, well, they've decided, they're mathematicians, they say, oh, well, it's worth $1,500. So now we've got Lehman Brothers with a $500 liability, and we've got the corresponding asset worth $1,500. So we see a little bit of mismatch between the valuation of the assets and the liabilities here. But all of that's just fine because we don't have to implement FAS 157, which is mark to market. We don't have to value things for what they're really worth. And I just wrote an article on this called Fair Value Lying. And so that's what we're doing. We've got all these giant corporations that are lying about the value of their assets and their liabilities. And then all of a sudden, Lehman Brothers, they go bankrupt because they had to pay out too many of these fire insurance contracts. And so now someone owns a contract on the house to protect against fire, but the counterparty to that is gone. So of course, what's the value of that contract? Well, if we're using fair value lying, well, the liability might go into bankruptcy court and be bought up by someone who buys the other assets. So in that case, it might still have value, even though the person's bankrupt. At least that's what our wonderful people at the SEC seem to think. But in reality, we know that it's worthless. And because it's worthless, we have to figure out, what happens? Now, the house hasn't burned down yet. So what happens if the house does burn down? well, the notional amount, the $100,000 is owed, becomes the nominal amount. So no longer is it this small $1,000 amount, but it becomes the full $100,000. And so that's actually what's happening with a lot of these OTC derivatives, is that they're the nominal amounts that they're carried on the balance sheets at, which with Lehman Brothers was maybe $1 trillion. Well, they're ballooning into these huge notional amounts of multiple trillions, or tens of trillions, or even hundreds of trillions in some cases. Like J.P. Morgan has about 100 trillion of notional amount of OTC derivatives. No one knows how to really value these. And so this is the problem that we run into with this credit expansion. For 800 years, capital has been moving up into less safe, less liquid assets. And now, like a ball thrown into the air, eventually gravity asserts itself. I mean, this is basic economic law. And the zenith of this expansion was reached, and now it's beginning to fall down. And the system doesn't collapse, but it evaporates. That $1,000 asset on the balance sheet, or $1,500 asset, it just evaporates into nothing. It becomes absolutely worthless. It just evaporates. So people are like, well, where'd all the money go? Well, really, what they're asking is, well, where'd all the illusions go? And the answer is, well, they evaporated. they just dissipated into nothing. And sometimes, all the debt remains on the balance sheet with the different companies or individuals. So you have the value of the assets just completely dissipate into thin air, while at the same time you have these, you still owe these illusions, which you have to then go out and try and find. So now, because the system reached the zenith and has begun to go the other way, we're in what's called the Great Credit Contraction. This is what I've written my book about. And during the Great Credit Expansion, we had strategies for growing and preserving wealth that worked. But now the entire environment has changed. And so we need new strategies, and we need new tools for protecting and preserving our wealth. And so I talk a little bit about those in one of the later chapters, how we can protect and preserve our wealth in this current environment, because we're seeing a lot of people's wealth just evaporate into nothing. We've seen multiple billionaires that are worthless now, and it'll probably only continue we'll see counterparties begin to fail and things like that. And that's where the role of gold and silver come into play, because gold and silver are money. They have value in themselves, and they're not subject to counterparty risk. And with 100% reserve banking, they're not subject to counterparty risk on the deposits. So what we've had is during this Great Credit Expansion, we've moved from using money with 100% reserves to using illusions with fractional reserve banking, with in many cases no reserves at all.
Right. I know that you have a previous engagement today, and we certainly don't want to make you late for that. So I wanted to suggest, I know that you and I have talked about the new radio program that Radio CICN will be launching here in the next couple of weeks, called our Rocks and Stocks Report. So the next time we chat, why don't we do it as part of the Rocks and Stocks Report, and you can talk a little bit about gold and silver as money and how that might be a solution that, well, obviously it's going to be a solution for some other countries because there's a lot of chatter, especially at the G20, about other currencies that are gold-backed. So why don't we pick it up then? In the meantime, why don't you promote your website and let folks know how they can get a hold of this book that you've written?
Yep, okay, thanks, Michelle. Yes, I do have an engagement in a couple minutes, and so thanks for keeping tabs on the time, and I hope that the information I've shared has been pretty valuable. My website is runtogold.com. You just run to the gold to be safe. And my new book is available at creditcontraction.com. So it's called The Great Credit Contraction, and the URL is just creditcontraction.com. can go and get a copy of the book, and it's, keep in mind, it's just a general roadmap. It just helps provide some of these things, but it's done in such the logical and organized manner in which it's done is really in place to teach people these basics of monetary science and economic law, so that they can at least understand what's going on. Because a lot of these inmates running the asylum, I mean, they're infected with the financial insanity virus, and they genuinely think, because bad economic laws have been taught everywhere, they genuinely think that when they throw the rock in the air, that it'll just keep going up instead of coming down. And so a lot of people think that also. And so, they've seen their 401ks or their other assets just kind of decline in value, and they think, oh, well, I don't know what's going on. Well, yeah, I mean, you really got to have a good grounding in basic economic law. So that's how the book's written, and kind of its purpose is to help educate people on just some of the basics, like the law of gravity. Because, I mean, think of how difficult it'd be to build buildings or anything else if you didn't even understand the law of gravity. I mean, it'd just be, you wouldn't do very well. So anyways, that's a little bit about the book and my website, and yeah, we'll definitely have to continue this conversation on the next interview.
Well, and hopefully we'll do that soon. We want to thank you for coming on today. I know you've got a busy day ahead, so thank you for getting an early start and taking time to join us today.
Oh, you're welcome, Michelle.
Well, I hope you liked that first introduction to the Great Credit Contraction. It's an 88-page book available for immediate download, and I'd recommend everyone get a copy. I went over just the first few subsections of the first chapter. Well, you've been listening to the 29th episode of the RunToGold.com podcast. You've been listening to the RunToGold.com podcast, the premier source for applied monetary science on the web.